Hello class. This lesson is about the equation of exchange. The equation of exchange is about the only economic model we had that predates Keynes. It's a really simple model, but I find it very useful for students to get a grounding on the different competing models that we currently have. So, the equation of exchange is a simple formula, MV equals PQ. And if you look it up on the internet, you'll see it in several different forms. There's the Fisher form and the Cambridge form and so forth. But I think this form is the simplest one, MV equals PQ. And it's an accounting identity. Now what that means is the equation by itself is not controversial. Everyone will accept it as kind of a definition. So where the controversy comes in is through all the different assumptions that the competing macro models make about the different variables. So first let's define the variables. M stands for the money supply, and in a kind of a theoretical way the money supply is really simple, how much money is in the economy. But if you really tried to measure the money supply, it would be quite complicated because there'd be a huge debate about what you would include and what would you exclude. For example, you would probably include the money in your wallet and the coins in your pocket, but some people would want to include the money in your checking account, but others maybe wouldn't want to include that because you can't always write a check. And then what about the money in your savings account? That is, accounts that you have at banks that you can't really write checks against, but you could easily go down to the bank and get the money out. Would you count that as money? And what about the money you had in a stock market account, where maybe you could even write a check on a stock market account? Would you count that as money? And what about the money you have tied up in other kind of assets that you may have, like an automobile or a car or a life insurance policy? And what about the debt limit you have on your debit card? Like maybe you can borrow on your debit card up to $10,000. Would you count that as money? So I hope you can understand that there's a huge controversy about what we should include and what we should exclude. The most common definition of money includes coins, plus the folding money in your wallet, plus the money in your checking account, and that's called M1. But the second most common one is called M2, and it includes everything that's in M1, plus money that's in saving, or what we call time accounts. Anyway, so M stands for the money supply. V is the velocity of money, that is the number of times a dollar changes hands in exchange for goods and services in a year, the velocity of money. If you thought about the velocity of the money that's in your wallet, that is a $1 bill that's in your wallet, the velocity of that particular $1 bill is probably quite large, maybe as high as 150. So if a dollar just got spent every other day, it would be spent 150 times in a year. More really. But remember, the velocity of money also includes the money that's in your checking account, and that money gets spent at a much slower rate. So the actual velocity of money, when economists try to measure it, is a much smaller number. Okay, so P stands for the price level, or average price of each good produced in the economy, and Q stands for output, or the number of transactions. You might find in some book the equation of exchange written out as MV equals PT, and that T comes from that word transaction, but I normally use the word Q. It stands for transactions if you like, or really output. Okay, so now we have MV equals PQ. Now, what are the competing models? Well, the first one and the oldest one is the classical model, and it goes like this. Remember, under the classical model, the assumption is that markets clear pretty well, that supply and demand works pretty efficiently. So therefore, under the classical model, Q is pretty much the best it can be all the time. That is, the economy is pretty much doing the best it can all the time because the markets are clearing efficiently. So Q is assumed to be fixed, and I'll just indicate that with a little bar over the variable Q in the equation. Then V is also assumed to be fixed because in the classical model they say that V depends in part on the technology of banks to clear the checks, but also on people's preferences for how much money they want to hold. I remember when that idea was first put to me, I was confused because I thought, well, people want to hold as much money as they can get. But that's not really true. That's not what we're talking about here. It's like how much of your assets do you want to hold in the form of cash? So, Bill Gates is quite wealthy, but I'm sure he doesn't have $1 billion of cash in his wallet. So V is assumed to be fixed, again because of banking technology and based on people's preference for how much money they would like to hold. Alright, so then we have a bar over V and over Q. Therefore, it should be kind of easy to see that under these assumptions, an increase in the money supply is going to result in inflation. So you can see it here. If we increase M, and I indicate that with that little arrow, then there would have to be an equal and offsetting increase in P to keep that equation in equilibrium. So this is the basic classical model. And it leads to a famous quote, I think it comes from Milton Friedman, that says inflation is everywhere and always a monetary problem. Inflation is everywhere and always a monetary problem. In fact, here's a piece of trivia that you won't find in any book, but back in the olden days, before we began to measure the inflation rate, the consumer price index has really only been calculated since the Great Depression. So before that, the idea of knowing what average prices were doing was kind of foreign, but the word inflation had existed in economics long before. But back in those days, that is before, say, the 1930s, when you heard somebody use the word inflation, they were talking about inflating the money supply. Inflating the money supply. But under the classical model, inflating the money supply and inflated prices are all the same thing. Alright, so that's the first one. The second one is very similar, and I call this the classical model with Friedman's modification. So Milton Friedman took the classical model and he changed it around just a little bit. The first thing he said is, you know what? Q is not really fixed. It's easy to go to the library and look at the GDP data and you can see that gross domestic product rises a little bit every year. So he worked it out for a long time series and he determined mathematically that Q is rising at a rate between 2 and 3% every year. So what Friedman did is he took the bar off of Q and instead he made this little notation that Q is rising on average 2 or 3% a year. Now of course some years it rises much faster, in other years, like in recession years, it actually falls. But on average, that is if you took an average across many years, you would see that it's rising on average 2 or 3%. Then Friedman let stand the assumption about velocity. He used a lot more complicated language. He said that velocity is really exogenous to the equation of exchange, but it's normally distributed around some mean, and for all intents and purposes we can assume it's fixed. But it's good enough for me if you can just remember that in the Friedman modification, the velocity is again fixed, just like it was in the classical model. So now, if your goal is to have stable prices, that is, you want this thing to stay the same, but you got Q increasing 2 or 3%, what is it that you need to do? What you need to do is you need to increase the money supply 2 or 3% a year to offset the increase in Q that's going on over here so that P will be constant. So again, if your goal is to have stable prices, that is P constant, you should increase the money supply at the rate of 2 or 3% a year every year to counterbalance the increase in Q. Now this thing that you see there has become known as Friedman's rule. Friedman's rules. He said we should just have a rule and live by this rule. You could have a computer do this. You wouldn't need Ben Bernanke or the Board of Governors or any of those staff economists at the Federal Reserve. You could just have this rule and a computer could increase the money supply 2 or 3% a year. Alright, now of course Ben Bernanke, who's head of the Fed, who's very respectful to Friedman, would argue, no, we can do better. Why should we tie our hands with this rule? We can use our knowledge of the economy and our modeling to do better than this. But Friedman would argue, no, you can't, that when you try to use discretion to increase the money supply, more times than not you will make things worse, not better. So Friedman was a big advocate of this rule and we named it after him. Alright, the next one is what Keynes himself thought. Now there's a little bit of difference between what Keynes thought and what we now know as Keynesian economics. So Keynes has been dead for quite a while, but when Keynes was living, this is what he thought. He thought Q depended on aggregate demand, of course, and not on the money supply. So he didn't think Q was going to move, and he assumed P was also fixed. In fact, he almost never talked about P. So in the Keynesian idea, what Keynes thought was that if you increase the money supply, people, or maybe banks, would just hold the money. That's just another way of saying that velocity would fall. So in terms of the arrows, it would be like this. M goes up, but there's a counterbalancing reduction in V, and nothing happens to P or Q. So I hope you can see from this that Keynes thought monetary policy, that is, increasing or decreasing the money supply, would be ineffective. Monetary policy would be ineffective. If you increased M, all that would happen is that V would go down, nothing would happen on the right-hand side. Alright, then modern Keynesian economics is, a little different. Modern Keynesian economics says, okay, yes, Q is affected only by aggregate demand. That's true, Professor Keynes, but if M is increased, it will drive interest rates down, and this will encourage business investment. And you have to remember that business investment is one of the components of aggregate demand. That's kind of hard to remember until you begin to see the algebra in the Keynesian model. So later that'll be easier to see. But for now, business investment is a component of aggregate demand. So by increasing M, we can increase aggregate demand, and Q would then increase. So P, again, wasn't discussed much in the original Keynesian work, so it's safe to assume he thought P would not be changed. Therefore, according to modern Keynesian modeling, if we increase M, Q will increase. You can see it right there. If we increase M, Q can go up, P doesn't move, and I guess by assumption V didn't move either in modern Keynesian economics. Alright, so that's what Ben Bernanke thinks. In fact, Ben works hard to move the money supply up or down because he has this idea that by controlling the money supply he can manage growth in the economy. Alright, yeah, okay, so in modern times this is what the Federal Reserve does. It controls the money supply in an effort to control economic growth. Alright, so the last one is this Austrian idea. The Austrian economists, remember, reject the idea of aggregating up stuff, and the equation of exchange is just an aggregation. In fact, they would probably say it like this. It's a gross simplification of what's really going on, and then they would remind everywhere that the economy does well or not well based on how well things are coordinated and not what's going on in the money supply. In fact, they would argue, I haven't done it in this lesson, but they would argue that when you begin manipulating the money supply, increasing it or decreasing or whatever, you send false signals all through the economy that causes people to make very poor decisions about what to purchase, what to save, and how to direct resources. And it sort of lays the groundwork for a future recession. So that's not in this lesson, and I'll give that to you later. It's enough now to just know that under the Austrian assumptions, the equation of exchange is kind of a theoretical, simple thing, and it doesn't speak very well about what actually happens in the economy. Okay, I hope you found this helpful. Good luck.